Joe?
Okay, thanks. Right, well, I'm sure that we've all lost count of how many times over the recent weeks we've been told that the government is following the science in its attempts to lead us through the current COVID pandemic. Scientific advisors of all stripes have never had so high a profile. Since at the moment, I happen to be deeply immersed in the life and times of a scientist who had a great deal to say about a much earlier pandemic, I thought it might be instructive, or at the very least interesting, to discover something of what he had to say, the context in which he said it, and the reactions to his words. I'm referring, of course, to William Buckland and the cholera pandemic of 1849. Now, for some reason, right, okay. Now, sorry about that. I'm sure that in this forum, Buckland needs no introduction, but just in case, a few salient facts to set the scene. He was born in Devon to an established clerical family, educated at Winchester and Oxford, and became Oxford's first professor of geology, effectively. Read numerous important papers at the Geological Society of London, of which he was twice president. He was a recipient of the Royal Society's Copley Medal and was the author of the Geological Bridgewater Treatise. Although his decidedly unclerical rhetoric made him something of a Marmite figure, by the time he was appointed Dean of Westminster in 1845, he had become what we might call an early Victorian celebrity scientist. So now, straight to 1849, and an all too familiar looking, unsquashed sombrero-shaped chart. We can see that by November of that year, the cholera infection in England was well past its peak. And the 15th of November was duly proclaimed a day of national thanksgiving, with services held in churches across the country. At Westminster Abbey, it was standing room only as Dean Buckland entered the pulpit to preach at the morning service. Disease was something that he thought he knew about. The previous year, he and some of his family had suffered from a bout of typhoid after builders had accidentally opened some old drainage in the Abbey precincts. Recognizing the probable source of this infection, Buckland had had the area cleansed and properly drained, and indeed, no further outbreaks occurred. This was by no means his first venture into matters of public welfare. 30 years earlier, he had led efforts to secure gas lighting for the streets of Oxford. He was later renowned for his sometimes flamboyant advocacy of fertilizers. He had advised on ways to secure clean water for London's expanding population and had served with Edwin Chadwick and others on the Commission of Metropolitan Sewers. In 1848, perceiving the threat posed by the cholera pandemic as it spread across the world, he had begun to collect what he called a mass of information, less on the treatment of the disease than on its prevention. And his sermon would be a combination of theology and science. He spoke for over an hour, beginning with the Old Testament story of Naaman, cured of leprosy after reluctantly following the prophet Elisha's advice to bathe in the River Jordan. Exhorting his congregation to follow the Syrian general and wash and be clean, Buckland said that it was a mockery to pray to God to preserve us from disease if we took no means of preservation. Then, drawing on his mass of information, with examples ranging from Edinburgh to the Channel Islands, he claimed that there was an inescapable link between the cholera and inadequate sanitation. Noting that well-ventilated, well-watered and well-drained towns had all escaped the worst ravages of the disease, while those that lacked these amenities had been struck hard. he did not hesitate to apportion blame, telling his audience that the greater number of the poor who perish are the victims of avarice and neglect of small landlords and owners of the filthy, ill-ventilated habitations. Fatal diseases are continually engendered from lack of adequate supplies of water, withholden from the dwellings of the poor by the negligence of the owners. It will be the fault of man, of the selfishness or the folly or avarice of the owners of poor houses, and it will be the fault of Parliament also if we do not instantly begin to remedy these crying evils, if in 2 or 3 years our city is not duly supplied with water. It was incendiary stuff, and as might be expected, it had a mixed reception. To his friends, it was just another of his utterances that could be captured in the humorous verse so popular at the time. This comes from a letter to Buckland from Philip Duncan, the keeper of the Ashmolean in Oxford, which of course was Duncan's original scientific base. The Times told readers that Buckland had delivered himself with his wonted energy and freedom of utterance. And despite going deep into natural causes, readers would be reassured that he had not precluded the idea of a divine interference, nor left the matter without improvement to the heart of the Christian. Others were much less complimentary. The Standard asked, what materialist inspector of sewers or sanitary commissioner might have uttered these theses upon the omnipotence of human means? Suggesting that its readers expected a much simpler message from their preachers, it proclaimed, except ye repent, ye shall all likewise perish. It was, however, the fashionable Tory-leaning Morning Post that was the most scathing. When such visitations are abroad on the earth, it declaimed, much trash will be talked. Then, having denied that insanitary conditions could be blamed for the epidemic, the Post's writer attacked the author of such an idea. The proverb, ne sutor ultra crepidam, which roughly translates as cobbler stick to your last, is one which may be liable to some misapprehension when applied to Dr. Buckland, as there is no employment in which the Dean is so little at home as in the Holy Office, which he has taken on himself. But as Dr. Buckland is an eminent geologist, we may use the adage above quoted in recommendation to him to confine himself as much as possible to those jokes upon coprolites which give such unmixed satisfaction to the Geological Society's meetings, rather than peril his reputation in other spheres of action. It was, I think, a cruel verdict on a man who, whatever his idiosyncrasies, whatever his failings, had accomplished so much. A man who had, throughout a long life, tried so hard to follow the science. We can't possibly know at what personal cost Buckland wrote and delivered that Thanksgiving Day sermon, nor what toll the ensuing criticism may have had on his health. We do know that even as he mounted the steps of the pulpit on that November day, he was sinking in what appears to have been a kind of dementia. Within 3 months, he would tell the Queen that his illness makes his attendance, to Abbey duties that is, if not impossible, yet in the highest degree distressful. By March 1851, he was in an asylum where on the 14th of August, 1856, he died. Meanwhile, 2 years earlier, the cholera had returned to London. And having made a careful analysis of cases in Soho, the physician John Snow removed the handle of one of the public water pumps supplying the district. Note the geological marking of the spot. The source of contaminated water having been eliminated, the disease abated. And the case of the Broad Street pump is now legendary in the annals of epidemiology. But when it came to following the science, William Buckland, a Doctor of Divinity and furthermore a geologist, had been on the right track all along. Okay, sir.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. That's extremely interesting and quite illuminating. So thank you very much indeed. Now, what I'm going to try and do in a minute is ask you all to unmute, and then we have 5 minutes which we'll try some discussion if somebody has questions or points that they would like to raise. If not, then we can proceed. Now,
just to let you know, Duncan, I can see everything now.
Okay, good. Well done. Thank you. Well, I'm pleased to learn that, John.
You can't.
Now, does everybody know how to raise your hand? Is there anybody who wishes? Let me ask: is there anybody who wishes to say anything? If so, please raise your hand, and I will quickly look down the participants list.
Reactions.
It's not showing actually.
That's Patrick.
Patrick, would you like to make a comment?
Well, comment is I'm not getting the orange symbol to allow me to put my hand up.
Okay.
No, neither am I. I think, Duncan, you said you were going to turn it off, so we can't see it.
Okay. Anyway, I thought it was very, very, very interesting indeed. Very good, Peter. Just 2 points, I think, in terms of the context. What Westminster Abbey is unique in that the dean is not subject to any sort of outside control. There is a chapter, but it's not subject to the control of a bishop or archbishop. And because of that, I think that the authorities were all very scared about letting them loose on this one. Queen Victoria actually vetoed his appointment to begin with, and very rapidly, Robert Peel, who was pushing him, moved Soapy Sam to Oxford as bishop. Sam Wilberforce was the dean. He was moved to Oxford, and Buckland got in on the second try. And he chose himself to make that sermon. Normally they would get Archbishop of Canterbury or somebody to do it, but he cave in and took the sermon himself, and that's how the whole thing came about. He was actually a founder member of the Civil Engineers Institute, and took a leading role in getting a pilot new sewerage system for Westminster, which was then taken up later by Bazalgette with the big scheme for Central London as a whole. But anyway, thank you very much for all that.
Thank you, Patrick. Is there anybody else who would like to make a comment?
Yes, Tim Carter.
Okay, Tim Carter, and then it looks as that is that you, Bev?
Chris.
Right. Okay. First of all, Tim Carter, please.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I enjoyed that very much. You said he was on the Sewerage Commission with Edwin Chadwick. I wonder if there's any correspondence or anything that links him to the views of Chadwick, because what he was saying was very close to Chadwick's position.
I'm not certain. The only the resources that I've used for this have been newspapers rather than correspondence. What was available to me sitting up in my eyrie in Kendal rather than in any archive. So I don't know, but I would imagine his views were actually quite similar to Chadwick's.
Yeah.
Overall, I mean, the sort of paternalist view of things, I think would have been quite appropriate.
Just coming back on that, he was extremely hard, went extremely hard on the Irish potato famine. He was on the commission for that, and he was again very loud in denouncing the iniquities of the landlord system and the way in which the properties are being managed and people living in this terrible conditions. So that was what, 2 years before. Okay, thanks.
Yes, yeah, that was at the time that he was appointed to Westminster, wasn't it? That he was speaking about the potato famine, and as you say, he had an awful lot to say on that, and it all seemed to me to be spoken from a very humanitarian viewpoint. But of course, he was a Tory, I suppose a Peelite Tory, we have to say, and he didn't, I think, didn't see that these problems could, or he thought that these problems could be ameliorated, but that the poor, as it were, would be always with us. He didn't see that there was a final solution to it, just an amelioration.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you're next, and then Bev, and then Paul Henderson.
Well, I was fascinated to see about mentioning about the coprolites, because I hadn't realised until recently what huge excavations there were for the coprolites, actually for the fertiliser industry. And so obviously it was a much bigger thing to the Victorians, coprolites, than obviously we think of now when we think of collecting fossils and general geology.
Indeed. Yes, I think coprolites were much better known, as you say, for their phosphorus for the fertiliser industry. In fact, they were the major source, I think, at one stage.
Indeed.
But not that I'm an expert on that by any means. But yes, thank you. No, that's actually very interesting. And clearly it was a common reference, which had that statement been put out today, nobody would probably properly understand.
No.
That is the interesting point. And actually you make the point, it's all about context. And we need to consider context very, very carefully when we're actually looking back in history. So I think it's an important point you make. Thank you. Bev.
Yeah, there was a huge debate going on at the time between the people who followed the miasma theory of disease, so disease being spread through noxious vapours, and people who are experimenting with other theories well in advance of Robert Koch discovering the first evidence of microbiological transmission. But as early as 1830, the cartoonist Cruikshank produced a wonderful cartoon depicting the horrendous state of the River Thames and how contaminated it was. And in the usual way of political cartoons at the time, it had a lot of captions. And one of them is a caption from one of the people sort of staring at this horrible soup, saying, "My goodness, we shall all get the cholera and die." So there was clearly a perception within the community, at least among some people, that sewage could be responsible for cholera, even though, as you say, it was John Snow who finally demonstrated that it was a waterborne disease.
Very interesting. Thank you. Yes, yes. And again, it's you have to look back and try and understand the context of how they were thinking about these things, in order to fully get a picture of what the issues were and what was said and why it was said. So again, very important points. Thank you very much indeed. And some useful epidemiological background there as well. Paul, you had your hand raised. Paul Henderson.
Just a minor deviation from the main thrust of the talk. I just wanted to show you, if you'd like to see it, of course, the diagram from the Bridgewater Crises that he did. This magnificent depiction. I hope you could see that. Was it visible?
Yes, indeed.
And that hangs on my study wall as a sort of proud memento of Buckland's achievements geologically. And quite a lot of the stuff, of course, in that wonderful depiction of the geology as he saw it, still stands pretty much on the right track even today.
Although there is a moot point about actually how much of that, certainly in terms of the section, is actually the work of Thomas Webster. The fossils and the way they are arranged,
yes,
is definitely Buckland.
Yes, at the top of it, yeah.
There is an interesting discussion to be had about whether actually the artwork, so to speak, is, I mean, it is credited partly to Webster,
yes,
but whether it was actually Webster's conception rather than Buckland's conception. And I think that's an interesting area for somebody, if you have some time anywhere and a project you want to work on, that would be an interesting project to work on.
Well, perhaps Peter can take that on.
There we go. Anyway, but yes, thank you. It is a magnificent section. If you haven't seen it, it's certainly worth looking at, and it's certainly a splendid thing to have on your
Hello
wall.
there.
I think you're on the right track.
It's all right, I'm standing a bit strange.
I'm going to hold it there because otherwise we shan't get to finish. Certainly, might be pushed to finish on time anyway, but we'll try and finish by 2 o'clock or whatever. It's now my turn to try and talk, and so I'm going to try and share my screen now. Now, I've had some problems with my PowerPoint, so you'll have to tell me whether it's, but I've got it in 2 ways, so we'll have to see how it works. This is going to work. Now, I'm going to go into, have you got full screen on there? Or have you got the edit mode?
Edit.
Edit.
Yeah, I've got a bug in my PowerPoint which doesn't like it on Zoom. That's part of the problem.
You're in edit mode, you're not in full screen.
No, I'm in full screen mode here, but it doesn't come up on Zoom. It doesn't work like that. Well, let me just go out of that then, and I'm going to go to another one in a minute. Just hang on a minute. I'll go back.
Go to slideshow.
No, it doesn't work. I've gone to slideshow, and that I know it's a bit of a problem. Just a minute, and I'll get this. What do I want to do? Stop share, and I'm going to go to share again. This time, I'm Keynote. Hopefully, it should come up with the Keynote. And this time, have you got a full screen now?
Ah, yeah, well done.
Okay, well, I've got it in. This is on Keynote rather than on PowerPoint. PowerPoint doesn't seem to work on with Zoom for some reason. So anyway, we have it now.
Could you mute everybody before you start, please?
I will try. I can't. Not sure I can come out of my. I've got no mouse now. Hang on a minute. Let me just come out again. And I'll mute everybody. Just one moment. And I've got Nina Morgan who wants to join.
Can't we all mute ourselves?
You can do, but I'm going to mute you all now. And then we'll start again. Okay, let's try again. I've muted you all. Hello, Nina, if you managed to get here. Okay. I'm going to talk about William George Fearnsides, and my talk is called Geologist on the Home Front in World War I, Finding Resources in a Time of Crisis. And I hope this should put a new perspective, I think, on the idea when we're talking about geologists in times of war. You're probably most familiar with Fearnsides through this book, Geology in the Service of Man. Certainly if you're my age or older, you will recall this book, and there are still quite a number of copies around. It's sold very well, and there's Fearnsides, as you can see on the left-hand side, and that's probably what he's most famous for in the public domain, and probably in the geological domain as well. That's probably what he's most well known for. some facts really, as Peter had started, but some facts about Fearnsides. He's actually a Yorkshireman born in Horbury, just outside between Dewsbury and Wakefield. He was educated at the grammar school in Dewsbury. And in 1898, he went up to Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge on a scholarship. His father was lower middle class and really was a grocer. He owned a grocer's shop. So wasn't really sort of well endowed with funds, but he did get this scholarship. And he was also awarded a college scholarship once he got there, because once the West Riding scholarship ran out, which I think was for a year, he then was awarded a college scholarship because he was doing very well. He ended up with a first class honours in both parts of his natural sciences tripos. I mean, alongside the following year, I think it was certainly O.T. Jones, F.W. Harker. So he was amongst luminaries in achieving his scholarship. He got the Harkness scholarship, and in 1901, once he'd finished, he went to the US as apprentice to Westinghouse as an apprentice. But he had an altercation with his superior. I've never quite understood what that was, but it came to fisticuffs one way or the other. And Fearnsides was quite an athletic man. But anyway, he left, and he decided that what he would do is tour the USA. He didn't want to leave the USA, he wanted to see something of the country. So he toured the USA and he sold papers on trains to fund his travels, and got a ship back on a cattle boat, and funded himself to get back there. Once he got back, though, he was penniless, and I think he had to pawn, the tale is that he had to pawn his watch once he got to Southampton to get his train fare home. So quite a character in many ways. In 1901, he returned to Cambridge. Incidentally, when he'd arrived home, he found that his father had died just the day before. So he returned to Cambridge and worked as a private supervisor and coach. But he was eventually elected a fellow of Sidney Sussex College in 1904, a post he held until 1915, and he was appointed a college Taylor lecturer in natural sciences in 1908, and then, as you can see, he became a university demonstrator in petrology in 1909. His main research when he was at Cambridge, he did a lot of work on the lower Paleozoic. And what I'm going to show you now is a focus of his published work, and this is from his titles, and I've just done a Wordle which picks out really what his focus was from 1903 to 1913, so when he really was at Cambridge and working at Cambridge. And you can see it was on Paleozoic, it was on the lower Paleozoics. You can see East Carnarvonshire there, and it was largely actually on the Tremodosian and the Arenig. And he did a lot of sort of work that became the platform, certainly for 60 years. It's now been slightly overturned, or at least it has been overturned, not least in the light of plate tectonics and in the light of understanding modern sedimentology. Some of it's been overturned, but it provided a really good platform. And he was working with the fossils as well. He worked out the faunal sequence there. And then he was looking at also at the petrology, looking at the igneous suites there, and trying to decide how and when they were intruded or extruded, and what the sequence of it all was. And actually managed to work out in quite a complex area of geology. He managed to work out what the situation was. You can also see right at the bottom there, it says rocks of Scandinavia, because he translated some of this across to part of Scandinavia, part of Norway and Sweden on that border there, and again became an expert on that part of the Upper Cambrian Lower Ordovician boundary. In fact, he was the first to define it in that part of Scandinavia. In 1913, he was appointed the first Sorby Professor of Geology at the University of Sheffield. That was endowed in 1908 by H.C. Sorby. He left it in his will, and Fearnsides was appointed. In 1914, you can see he read before the Sheffield Society of Engineers and Metallurgists his inaugural lecture, in essence. The first Sorby lecture was on some structural analogies between igneous rocks and metals. So you can see where his interest lay. And in fact, I forgot to mention that Fearnsides had originally gone up to Cambridge as a chemist. but he quickly switched to geology during his, when studying his tripos, decided that geology was the thing in which he should do. But he had intended to be a chemist, so he came with a chemical background. But you can see there, he considered the role of a provincial university was to support local industry, not least because many of the local industries were the principal benefactors of the university, one of whom was, well, H.C. Sorby wasn't an industrialist, but there were a number of big industrialists in Sheffield, notably Mark Firth, who had funded the university. So this role was quite important. And Sheffield University at this time had not been in existence that long. It had been in existence for about 20 years. So it was still important. But he made quite a lot of networking with local industrialists. Just to focus you back, I want you to just quick look back. We've seen this already, but I'm just flashing that up now because I'm now going to go, this is 1914 to 1918, and this is the focus of his work. And I did exactly the same exercise. And I'll let you look at that for about 10 seconds because you'll notice there's a striking difference in his work. Here there's a focus on Sheffield, there's a focus on coal measures, refractory material, I'll talk about this, underground contour comes up a lot, effects of earth movement, Yorkshire coalfields, supplies, and that interesting one, oven brick down there. We then have to think about the role of Sheffield to begin to understand this in World War I. And Sheffield really was a crucial in creating the British war machine for World War I. In fact, prior to World War I, and in fact, just in the years before the outbreak of war, Sheffield was the foremost armaments place in the world, manufacturer, and would sell to actually anybody. But you can see there that it was hugely important. Vast amounts of armaments were made in Sheffield, and of course that needed steel. And particularly, if as the picture shows, it shows armor plating steel being produced at Camel Laird's, and that required a particular sort of steel. It was a very specialist steel in order to be very armor protecting. We can also look, this is actually from one of his papers, which I'll make a comment about later, but we can also see, here's the output of steel, British output of iron ore and iron, and you can see that the output from 1913 takes a bit of a drop, but then it really drops in terms of the output in terms of 14-15. And on the lower graphs, that top line is added up from the lower lines, but you'll see that the imported ore, that's that top lower line, is much greater than the internal ore, than the ore obtained from British ore, which is the black steady line. So we imported much more iron ore than we did produce. And of course, in wartime, that doesn't make for a very stable or secure position. What was important, though, is that the way in which ore was made into steel or converted into steel, there are two methods really. There's Bessemer converter and the Siemens open hearth. Both of those, you had a big furnace, and the furnace needed to be lined, and it was lined with refractory bricks. And this one was made locally, actually, to where I'm sat now, and you can see there's a D in it, and it was made by a company called Dyson's, who were making these bricks. And they were making them out of material which is called ganister. And this process had been known really since the sort of about the late to the 1870s. Ganister is a very fine, clean quartzitic sandstone, and you can see there it's been mined. And actually, the picture bottom left, I'm looking at that location as I look out the window here, and there's a ganister mill on the right hand side. But it was ground down. You can see there the quartz, the clean quartz on the top right hand side. And the reason is that the silica, to make these silica bricks, that would actually do two things. It would retain the heat for the furnace. It would stop the lining of the furnace from being damaged. And the second thing it would do is it would also help react with the slag, which was very acidic, and that would impact on the quality of the steel that they would make. Well, what's Fearnsides got to do with this? Well, he wrote in terms of refractory, he went and looked at refractory materials. And this is his explanation of it, actually, in a paper he gave in 1917. The choice of refractory materials for use in the glasshouse is a responsibility which has hitherto fallen to my lot, geologists, has not hitherto fallen to my lot, geologists, as I do not feel that I can speak with authority on this subject. I propose to deal with briefly the distribution of those refractory materials which I know are actually in use in British furnaces. Most of the work in connection with the experimental study of refractory materials, which has been and is being taken up by my department, has been forced upon it by the circumstances of the war, and has arisen in an endeavour to answer inquiries made by men whose interests are largely bound up with the Sheffield steel industry. Persons concerned with British iron and steel-making trades have, since the beginning of the war, been faced with a shortage of many of the essential mineral raw materials, whilst for a continued supply of the refractory materials needed for furnace construction and repairs, they have been frequently very hard pressed. And so they went to the geologists for help in finding alternative supplies of materials. Presently, however, they recognise the furnace linings, which give a long life and continuous output of metal, are the most economical. And so his concluding was here, this is actually the abstract of his paper: the increased life of a furnace brings with it a decrease in the consumption of materials used in the furnace construction. Hence, by the improvement in the design of the furnace and by the selection of the refractory materials more exactly suited to the working conditions, the available supply of refractory material is made to go further, and the shortage of that supply thus becomes less acute. And with there, you get an insight into his mind as to why he went into this particular field. That was one field then, so that was refractories. The second thing he worked on was on coalfields. And this is a paper read before the BA in 1915, and it's on the underground contours of the Barnsley seam of the coal in the Yorkshire coalfield. And this paper, I won't bring it up all, but in essence, this was by plotting the contour lines on a half-inch contour map, the interdependence of underground structure with the topographical relief of the area of those exposed coalfield has been well brought out. And what he did he was the first to create a structure contour map. And as he says here, from his experience, the application of the contour method to the study of tectonics, the author suggests that the method is of peculiar usefulness in coalfield work. Indeed, it was. And this is a slightly later map of the sorts of maps he was producing. But instead of a straight north-south, west-east dip and north-south strike, he understood that actually the coalfield structurally was much more complex. And so that he was able to direct coal mines when they were working in a seam, when they came up against a blank, they were able to use his information to actually more accurately work out where that coal seam had gone and in which direction they needed to work it. That was hugely important in terms of the output, increasing the productivity of those mines. Last but not least, I'm going to say that one of the things he worked on was iron ore. And in 1917, he was invited to give a lecture, the Howard Lecture, to the Journal of the Royal Society of Arts. And he's, as you can read here, I would propose more particularly to emphasize the importance to Britain of continental supplies of metal, which has its origins in the Minette district of Lorraine, having recently assembled from other purposes massive statistical information about the iron and steel in which previous decades was imported from overseas. Just a slight aside, I have these letters, by the way, and just as a slight aside, one of the things that later on, incidentally, that's from Sheffield, this is from Blaenau Festiniog, so we're still obviously doing some work in North Wales. But he here says that he wants to change the title from cheap ore to, in fact, it becomes to non-phosphoric iron ore, because he thought the idea of cheap ore was ambiguous, and it really wasn't probably very good for the war effort either. This is his lecture, which is it was the foremost summary of our position at the time, which was then published in 1917, and you can see the output here. And you can look at Great Britain, which is the dashed line, compared with Germany, which is the solid line, and up until 1913. And you can see that the British output of iron was not phosphoric iron ore was not very good. he concluded in this manner here. And what his conclusions were is that we could use the hematite, which is largely over in the west coast and up in Cumberland, and we should keep those. But of course, Cleveland was well known, but he was advocating that we should use the Lincolnshire outcrop and the Frodinger Ironstone to a much greater extent. And his work on the refractory methods was also significant with that. So, at the outbreak of World War I, he was 36. He previously worked on the Lower Paleozoic. He was able to visualize structures in 3 dimensions, and he used his background as a chemist, turning his geological attention to finding alternative supplies of iron ore and refractory materials, improving refractory processes, and solving problems of prospecting for coal with the development of structural contour maps. We all have done probably structural contour maps in our degrees. It's actually this man who invented that process. Little known, I think. And that was also necessary for the success of the Allied war effort in terms of supply. So his contribution was on the home front, arguably as significant as geologists on the battlefields. Thank you. Stop sharing. And you can all unmute yourselves if you wish. And I'm happy to take questions if you have any. No, Richard Porter, thank you.
Thank you for that, Duncan. As a Sheffield graduate, and I resided in Sheffield for many years before I moved to Devon, a lot of that was familiar to me, but excellently put and a very, very good overview. Particularly as I work for the military now and sort of have looked quite a lot at sort of geologist contributions to what the military have done. And just one comment really, it's nice to know that Fearnsides laid these foundations down, which were carried on by his 2 predecessors as Sorby Professor, Fred Shotton and Leslie Moore. Leslie Moore doing sort of very, very similar work right up until the time he retired in the late 1970s. But thank you, an excellent presentation, really enjoyed that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, with the time, I've only been able to really just scrape at the surface, and there's a lot more work. And I think there is work that's not done by Fearnsides, and it seems to me that he ought to be far better well known for his work. And I think you're absolutely right. He laid the foundation for what the excellent work that the Sheffield University Department of Geology then did in subsequent decades. And of course, Shotton was a huge influence in various ways. And so, yes, I think that was in part due to Fearnsides. I'd say there's a lot more to Fearnsides, which I've not been able to illuminate. And he's a fascinating character, that's for sure. So any other questions? Just check.
Just to say, oh, sorry, just to say that he was always very much indebted to Sorby. And one of his last, on his retirement, he created a Sorby Medal of the Yorkshire Geological Society for excellence in that area of applied geology.
He did. He was quite a benefactor. And as I say, there were lots of other sides to him. I mean, I haven't touched on I haven't gone into what he did during the Second World War, and his impact on the Second World War was also significant from a geological perspective, again, on the home front. And not least in terms of the fact that the Geological Society was collapsing during the Second World War because everybody was being pulled off to the front and various things. And Fearnsides was the president and kept it together. And that is also not particularly well acknowledged. So there are a number of facets to him that, as I say, I've just focused on his World War I activity. But hopefully it does highlight the impact of that war on the trajectory of somebody's career. So thank you. Cynthia.
Yeah, I just wondered, was he married?
Yes.
And had a family?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, so very much so. In fact, yes, he married his supervisor's daughter. So it became a bit of a geological dynasty, I think. Yeah, but anyway, that's right. Well, with that, thank you very much indeed to myself and everybody else for listening so carefully. And I will now hand over to our third speaker, which is John Mather. So John, I'm going to ask you to take the floor, if you would be so kind, and ask you to share your screen and talk to us. Thank you.
What have you done?
Yes, you're up and speaking.
It needs to go on.
I'll mute everybody, by the way.
Slideshow.
Marvellous, that's it. We can see you. John, sorry, John, hang on a minute. I think I've muted you as well, so I do beg your pardon. You'll have to unmute yourself. Let me just get you, do you? Can you unmute yourself, John, please?
How's that?
That's better. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry.
You've got me now?
I've got you now, yes. If you'd like to start now, that'd be marvellous. Thank you very much. I've muted
Okay,
you.
well, thanks very much, Duncan, and welcome to the northern edge of Dartmoor. I seem to have got everybody's pictures now, so I was able to see you all. Why we were a long time coming online, I don't really know. What I'm going to talk about a little bit this afternoon is the survey's response to the beginning of World War II. Those of you who were at the joint meeting of HOGG with the Society of Arts will know that I talked a little bit about the water supply congresses that the Society organised, at which they emphasised that it was a national survey of the sources of water supply, both surface and groundwater, were actually needed urgently, and pleas were made to central government, to the Prime Minister, for that survey to go ahead. But as so often happens with these sort of things, nothing happened at all. By the end of the Victorian era, the turn of the century, the survey themselves started to do a little bit of an analysis of groundwater and started producing these water supply memoirs, basically because they realized that the geological memoirs were becoming saturated with water supply boreholes, and particularly by people like William Whittaker and Clement Reid. And they, Geeky, started these water supply memoirs, the first of which was of Sussex, and that's the cover that I've got on the screen in front of you at the moment. The information of these in these things was actually pretty limited, and I've got a comment on the right by Bailey, who was to become director in the 1930s. He noted that there was an increasing realization that unchecked records of wells that have been sunk through ill-defined strata are apt to be misleading. And basically these things were full of records which nobody had checked, nobody had probably visited the site, and they were, well, it was almost, not quite useless, but almost useless. Nothing much happened. The survey was involved a little bit during the First World War, but the only thing they did on groundwater was to prepare this little leaflet. In fact, the survey more or less came to a halt during the First World War because professional geology was not a reserved occupation, and the work of the survey, except for some of the more senior members, basically ceased. Still, there was no national survey or anything of groundwater. The British Association formed a committee and proposed a water survey. Again, nothing much happened. Things were perhaps pushed along a little bit by a severe drought in 1933. And after that, the Ministry of Health did form an inland water survey committee, and they entrusted the groundwater work to the Geological Survey. When Bailey became director in 1937, he actually did form a little water unit, but really it had very few staff and very little progress was made in anything like a national groundwater survey. Now, things changed completely with the outbreak of war. For one thing, professional geology was a reserved occupation in the Second World War, so the survey staff weren't called up to fight. Bailey, in fact, recognised that there was a need for this basic information on water supply, on groundwater. I mean, what was happening was that there were airfields. If we were going to invade France, for example, you had to have stations over on the UK where up to about 10,000 incumbents needed to live, and they had to have a water supply and sewage facilities. So Bailey recognised this need for basic information, and in fact a plan was devised by Eastwood, who was the assistant director for England and Wales, and they implemented this plan in which memoirs, mapping, everything ceased, particularly in the south of England, and all the London-based staff were diverted onto groundwater work. That wasn't as many as it would be now, but there were about 20, almost 30 people were diverted onto looking at water supply. What that involved was a systematic revision of the information that was already in survey files, collection of data from, they visited water companies, well drillers, consultants. They actually went on field work to try and locate some of these sites and measured water levels, yields, water quality. The strata records were classified, and then the data were made available as required to local authorities, government departments, and individuals. The material was published or issued, let's say, in these wartime pamphlets. They were pretty crude things, actually. Paper was, of course, in very short supply, and they were sort of producing, the pamphlets were produced on a duplicated machine, a rather primitive duplicated machine called a multigraph. And the first ones that were issued, the first areas to be looked at was this area where I've got my pointer down. I hope you can see the pointer, on the base around Essex, Kent, this area, and then along in what was called the Cambridge Ipswich district. So the areas of the country which were closest to the continent and where there was the greatest need for water supplies. And these were issued, and by the end of the war, when there was there were 53 individual parts of these wartime pamphlets, of which most of them related to the southeast of England. The records which they well, as I said, the whole documents were fairly primitive, and this is an area around Bishop Stortford. I'm putting this up because I like to think that this was the area that was surveyed by Kingsley Dunham, who, although he was the petrographer in the survey, was assigned to this work along with everybody else in the London office. And he was involved in this survey of the Cambridge Ipswich sheet. you can see the sort of information that we've got. This top site here, 152, there's a little bit of data. They have no real idea of what the surface OD is. The borehole was drilled in 1859, disused, again disused. Really not very useful information. The only one that was visited and was found was this one here, where there was visited, in fact, in this case, in 1944. And you can see the sort of information, the surface OD, the height of the well top, whether it was a borehole or a well, where the rest water level was, what the yield was, and then a little bit about the geology. So this was the sort of information that was collected. Again, I like to think this was the area surveyed by Kingsley Dunham. Here we've got those three sites that that were on the previous slide, and you can see that they located what waterworks and pumping stations, other wells, and then there was wells sites not accurately known. In other words, they couldn't find them, but they knew that somewhere in that locality there was a borehole. And others which are not actually, I don't think here, but they couldn't find sites which were supposedly there at all. When I actually joined the survey, we were still doing some sort of this work, and this is me on the trying to get a sample out of a borehole. You can see what the state was of some of these places that were surveying. I say this is well over 50 years ago now, but you can see the shed where the well was has fallen down. There's an old sink here, and there's me here trying to dip the well and trying to get a sample out of it. Really, the information and data was fairly useless. These are the other sort of things that we're looking at, looking for. This is an old wind pump. This is in fact just down the road from where I live at the moment, and Jen and I took this slide about 3 days ago now. Some of these sites are still here, but totally really inaccessible. Now, what did they use the data for? Well, they produced a whole series of reports for really any government department that wanted them. There were 305 sites for the Air Ministry, the Water Department, the Ministry of Works, even 15 for the Admiralty, looking for water supplies for barrack blocks and things like that which were built. And overall, over 2,000 inquiries were answered over the period of the war. No real attempt was made to summarize the data and to do anything much with it, except by Austin Woodland, who was later to become, of course, director of the survey. And he produced a very good report of that Cambridge Ipswich area, summarizing the data. But generally, the role the survey took was to observe and record rather than to summarize and interpret the data. The pamphlets are basically well catalogues and not interpretive memoirs, so they're not very much use to us really nowadays. But the information was, of course, of considerable value in producing these little reports for the various government departments. And the reports themselves, people recognised that they were of value, and that they would have been of a value to the Germans who were planning what Operation Sea Lion to come into the southeast of England. And all the documents are marked. This document is confidential, should be kept under lock and key, and should be destroyed if there's any danger of it falling into the hands of enemy agents. And in fact, even during the First World War, the water supply memoirs that the survey produced were also looked upon as valuable, and all the Essex memoirs, for example, have this handwritten, all the copies of it I'd ever seen have all got this little annotation by William Whitaker that says, though printed off in 1916, this memoir was held back by the War Office until after the war, and it was not actually issued until 1980. But this idea of secrecy really was not of a lot of value, because the Germans were way ahead. They were already there. And this is a water supply map, which was generated for the German Ninth Army in preparation for this Operation Sea Lion, which was the invasion of England in 1940. And one of the invasion beaches that they were looking at particularly was this one along here. And you can see that we've got a rather simple groundwater map, where we've got this basically means the coastal lowlands, and the idea was that this was very little groundwater, unreliable springs, subject to contamination, so beware of it. This was the sand clay region, and here you can see they've marked on this German map, which was done, say, probably in 1939, before the war started. They've marked on a series of springs, all the boreholes, this little symbol BR, all the waterworks ready for the invasion, which of course never happened. This is translated, the original is in German, but we've, Ted Rose and I many years ago translated, or Ted did, the key to the map. But just to say that I think that's my last slide, but just to show in this little presentation how the survey's resources could be reallocated almost overnight from their memoir production into something which was of value at the beginning of the war. Thanks very much, Duncan.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. And we're now back to the screen. And so if anybody has any questions, we can take a few questions. We're a little bit over time, but I think everybody's probably okay. Anybody who's not okay will probably have left by now. So
we've still got 27 people.
Yeah, well, is there anybody who's got any questions at all, please? For John. Who's quickly looking. Nobody raised their hand. Yes, I mean, it was fascinating. At that time, did the BGS have regional? They did have regional offices, didn't they?
Yes, they did have regional offices, and although there was groundwater work done in the northern offices, I don't know whether there was a Cumbria unit at that time, but there were certainly units dotted around the country, quite small offices. But a lot of them, there was other work done on key mineral resources and things like that, and iron and ironstone resources. I think you were talking about Fearnsides in the First World War with the resources and with the ironstone resources, and there were reports on the Northamptonshire ironstone and things like that, which were produced as wartime pamphlets at the same time as the water supply ones would be produced.
Right, thank you. Tim Carter, you need to unmute yourself. Tim, you need to unmute yourself first. That's it.
Sorry, mistake. You've still got my hand up from an earlier question.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Beg your pardon. I thought you got your hand up on this occasion. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question for John? Or a discussion point? Chris, and then Cynthia. Chris, you have to unmute yourself.
Presumably all this information then went directly to the water boards immediately after the war, because I worked for Severn Trent for a while, and in actual fact we had enormous numbers of these boreholes, but nobody actually knew where a lot of the information had come from.
Well, I can't tell you whether they got it from the pamphlets. In fact, it may be that that central part, the Severn Trent region, was not actually covered by very much by the survey at that time, because they expanded over the whole of the country. Even into Scotland, there was quite a lot of groundwater work in the southern uplands done, and the water supply, and these wartime pamphlets were produced. But I would have thought most of the records that Severn Trent inherited would have come from the Geological Survey in one form or another. But I didn't join till '66, and it would be probably after the war in the early 1950s, perhaps, when this material was sent out to the water boards at that stage, because there was a whole series of very small water boards, of course, at that part.
Yes.
before Severn Trent amalgamated them all. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Cynthia. And then Patrick.
Okay.
Cynthia.
Me, yes. John, I found it very interesting that the geologists were a reserved occupation during the Second World War, but not the First.
Yeah.
Do you think the contribution of people like Fearnside actually got the government to change their minds?
Pass. I don't know what makes governments' minds up about that or many other things at the present time, but I don't. Perhaps there was more lobbying in the Second World War by people like Bailey, who was quite an influential guy at that stage, and it may be that there was some more lobbying done to central government. Perhaps they didn't need that vast manpower that they used in the First World War, of course, as well.
I think, I mean, it's a very interesting point, Cynthia, and I think it probably needs looking into to give an accurate answer. But I think it was that geologists, not necessarily on the home front, but certainly on the fighting front, had proved themselves, and as a result of that, there was a unit formed in the interwar periods, of which Shotton was part, and the Birmingham crowd. So I think it was that which probably influenced the fact that they thought, well, geology is more significant. But it is an interesting, I'm sure there's, again, another little paper in there somewhere.
Yes, thank you. And just very finally, I'm assuming that as they were all professional geologists, they were all male and women didn't participate.
I think you can take that as read, yes.
Obviously had to bring it up. Sorry, John.
Yes. Lynn Hendricks, who I've just been writing about, of course, she tried, but to get a job as a geologist somewhere during the Second World War, but failed. Yeah.
Patrick.
Yeah, just to comment really about the point from Severn Trent. They weren't just small areas. At least in the Trent Valley and right up in the Derwent Valley, around 10 or a dozen local authorities, including mine at that time, Leicester, were part of an enormous consortium which covered probably about half of what became Severn Trent in 1974. So they inherited large amounts of property and so on from there, including some land belonging to me, actually, as in the Leicester museums. But so there was the source of the information was very broad. What I wanted to ask John was, you were focusing on boreholes mostly. Was the survey involved in some of the big schemes for major new reservoirs or proposed reservoirs? I'm thinking of, for example, the purchase of the Farndale Valley in the North York Moors by Hull, with plans to have a reservoir sort of 2/3 the size of Lady Bower, which never came off.
Was that during Was that during the war, Patrick?
Those sorts of schemes.
Was that during the war or what?
Well, it was just before the war. 1930s, they bought the valley, and they were still trying in 1950 to drown all the famous daffodils.
I'm afraid I can't answer that question. I would have thought the geologists might have been, but it probably went out to consultants at that stage, but I couldn't really answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I think with that, it's now just turned actually 2:20, so we're a little bit later than anticipated, but I think that's because we've had some interesting and quite rich discussion too, alongside the talks. And I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along and joining, which has been our very first online event. And I hope you feel it's been successful. We're having a few glitches, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit slicker should we run another one. And I am hoping and intending that we run another one, and I would request that you please do email me with suggestions and offers to either to speak or to give a short presentation. And as I say, it could be this format, which I think works quite well, or it could be just a single speaker who's got a slightly longer talk to give. And I'm sure all three of us today could probably have made it a lot longer had we had that remit. But yes, I mean, we're really, it's in one sense, I'm throwing it open to you as to be able to organise another one of these, and I ideally wish that we are able to do that, because I think it, you know, it's something that we're able to do even under these rather strained conditions of meeting. So without further ado, I'd like to call the meeting to a close and say thank you very much indeed. It has been recorded. I will download it, and I might need to do a bit of editing. But I think it's been wonderful, and I really am grateful to you all for having come along and participated so magnificently. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. Okay.
Well done. Thank you for organising it, Duncan.
I now have the power, of course, to expunge you all, which I shall do. But thank you ever so much indeed, and we'll see you all.
Nice to see you, Martina. Hi, Martina. Nice to see you.
That's great, being in London without having to travel.
Yes, it must be. It must be. It's lovely. Martina's travelled all the way from Germany.